Thank you. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining today and for the opportunity to hear from Angie Schmitt, who is one of the leading lights in America's effort to be a safer place to walk. After I talk for a few minutes, I'll hand over the microphone and the presentation to Angie, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. I'd like to start by thanking our partner organizations who have brought this together, the coalition, the city of Charlottesville, who's hosting an Angie Schmitt book group, which we'll send details about that later, and the Coalition for Smarter Growth, which is a division of PC that promotes walkable, inclusive, and transit-oriented communities in the Washington, D.C. region. Our colleagues there are a great community resource. And Stuart Schwartz, their director, should be joining us today, and he'll be able to help answer questions on that end. My name is Peter Krebs. I'm community organizer for Charlottesville and Albemarl at the Piedmont Environmental Council. For those of you who are not familiar with PC, we're a community-based, locally supported nonprofit organization. For nearly 50 years, we have protected and promoted the natural resources, rural economy, history, and beauty of the Virginia Piedmont, and advocated for connected, livable communities. Our 9-county service area spans from Charlottesville and Albemarle in the south to Clark and Loudoun in the north. We are also engaged at the statewide, regional, and national scales on issues that impact the work that we do at the local level. We engage, educate, and empower residents around a host of different issues, including land conservation, good land use planning, local food and sustainable agriculture, public access to parks, greenways, and open space, water quality, wildlife habitat protection, and we do so through on-the-ground work in our backyard. It's not just abstract, it's very real for us. One of our areas of focus here in the Charlottesville-Albemarle area is working to create safe places for walking and biking connected to nature and to useful resources. To accelerate that work, we've been pulling together a diverse group of organizations, clubs, businesses, agencies, and passionate residents. There are many ways that you can get involved. You can join our advocacy list, add your organization to the Active Mobility Alliance that we're pulling together, and you can contribute to PC. None of this can happen without your support. We'll send out information about all of these things afterward. So I know that you're not here to hear from me. So I'd like to get to our star speaker tonight. Angie Schmitt is the principal and owner of 3 MPH Planning and Consulting, and one of the country's thought leaders on the topic of sustainable transportation. She was the longtime national editor of Streetsblog, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bicycling, and many other publications. Her new book is entitled Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. She is coming to us now from Cleveland, where she lives with her husband and 2 children. While we transition to Angie, let's share one last poll question. So everybody go ahead and fill out this poll while Angie gets her slides ready.
Give it another 15 seconds here, 10 seconds.
Looks like some people are saying they can't access any of them.
Yeah, we should have had none of the above. That's that's the crucial one. Well, you know, 57 people have responded and we have 80 participants. So perhaps that means 23 people say none of the above.
Marco, some people are having a hard time using the poll. There's I guess something to do with the browser.
That's all right. I think it's not a consequential poll, so I apologize if any of you were frustrated, wanted to fill that out, but I can go ahead and share the results here. You should be able to see that. So it looks like the vast majority of you can reach a park safely by walking. Coffee shop, very important, grocery store. So that's pretty good.
I'm kind of surprised. That's different than my research would indicate.
All right, well, we can hand it over to you, Angie, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm gonna do this. It's just gonna be awkward for 1 second. Cool. So yeah, my name is Angie Schmitt, and this is going to be a presentation about my book, which is called Right of Way. It was published by Island Press in August. And when I have to explain to people, you know, I wrote a book, what's it about? My sort of elevator pitch is always that it's about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. So in this presentation, that's what I'm going to be talking about, what that is, why it's happening, and sort of what we can do about it. Okay, so just a real quick overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the problem. I'm going to talk about who's getting killed. I'm going to talk about where they're getting killed. And then there's going to, just so everyone knows up front, there's a big section about cars, because that's part of the issue. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some potential solutions. Okay, so just going back, for people who aren't initiated, maybe this is a picture, you know, where I live. I'm from Cleveland. Cleveland in 1930. This is our main street. And this is, you can see here in this picture, 1930, there are a few cars already on the scene at this time, but still primarily, you know, a streetcar and walking-based transportation system at this time. And the main thing I want to point out here is just how much foot traffic there is, and additionally, how relaxed people look when they're crossing the street. One thing about this photo is there are no crosswalks at this time. People just kind of cross where they please. Okay, so back in these times, before cars became the main form of transportation in the United States, streets were places for a lot of varied activities, a lot of varied social activities. One of them was children used them for play, but also they were used for things like merchants would sell goods from carts. You know, neighbors would pause and talk to each other on the street. So they had sort of a social function, and that's one of the reasons like older homes are designed to sort of front the street and face that sort of friendly activity. Okay, but around this time, cars start entering the streets of cities in a big way. And there's a guy from Charlottesville. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him, Peter Norton. I just want to touch real briefly. He has some really important research on this topic. He writes about the history of this period of time in the United States. So around this period of time, the Model T Ford is invented, assembly line production. It brings the price of cars way down, and all of a sudden they start flooding into cities. And it's, you know, one thing he points out is traditionally the way we've thought of this is that there was this immediate frictionless adoption, and that Americans just loved cars and gladly gave up, you know, their old way of life. But he points out that's not actually true. And when cars started coming into cities in the 30s, they started killing people, a lot of people right away. And in large part, they were children. So there was a pretty furious reaction from city dwellers and especially mothers around that time. And there was some political calls to sort of limit the domain of cars in cities. So in response to that, there was an opposing political effort from a group he calls Motordom. And that included auto industry interests like car dealers and auto enthusiast clubs and gasoline sellers. And they came up with this idea of jaywalking, basically. And they introduced this notion that pedestrians should only be allowed in the street at certain marked locations, and even then, only when there wasn't traffic. So obviously, this was a very successful campaign. This is an example, again, from Peter Norton, of some propaganda that was used at that time. And this was a little leaflet that was, they had like Boy Scouts and groups like that distribute these in the streets of cities like, this is from Cincinnati in 1952. And one thing about this term and this kind of propaganda, the term jaywalker was actually sort of an insult. It was sort of like calling someone, the equivalent today might be like a hillbilly or something. So very, very much sort of a derogatory campaign, kind of implying that pedestrians that didn't follow the rules were stupid or deserving of being hurt. So that's really influenced the way we conceptualize this problem to this day and the way we've designed cities since then. So this actually is just 15 years later or 16 years later in Cleveland. This is a different street than I originally showed, but just to point out real quickly, again, this is only 16 years later. The change is pretty dramatic. The number of people compared to the whole sort of right away now is just monopolized by machines, and you don't see any people out at all. So it was a big shift. And the result is that pedestrians have become pretty marginalized. And I think this is a nice graphic produced by a Swedish thinker that just does a nice job illustrating it. Okay, so when I talk about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States, this is what I'm talking about. And over the last decade, basically, we've had about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. And one thing I want to point out about this is a really unusual sort of thing to happen in modern traffic safety history. Since around the 1970s, the Ralph Nader era, since we started requiring seatbelts, since we later on started requiring things like airbags, we've generally had decreasing traffic deaths. Although pedestrians did not benefit from those kind of things, when this first started occurring, 2012, 2013, 2014, a lot of people, even traffic safety experts, thought this was sort of a fluke, just didn't know what to make of this. But now we know it's a sustained trend, and we know a little bit more about what's causing it. Okay, so first off, I think the way this has been covered in the media and some of the stereotypes about who's getting killed are sort of a problem and prevent us from addressing this issue in a serious way. And so I think in a lot of cases, it comes down a little bit to privilege. And I think like for a lot of people, potentially, a medium columnist at a major city, when they think about, okay, pedestrians being struck by cars, who they think of as this guy here on the left. And he's like a very wired millennial, and he's crossing the street. Maybe he's distracted in like a major city in a crosswalk. And, anecdotally, these media figures who have a lot of prominence, that might be what they see on their drive to work. So that's what they think of. But really, the type of person that's being killed is much more like this guy here on the right, a guy that's just sort of sprinting across a very wide suburban arterial road that doesn't even have a crosswalk. Okay, so this is a problem that's a little bit like the way it presents itself is a little bit like coronavirus, where, with coronavirus, it would appear that it would impact everyone equally, or at least that was maybe the expectation at the start. But right away, it became really clear these inequalities we have in our society play a role in who is harmed by this. And this problem is the same way. So we know it's a problem that has a racial component. Hispanic folks are at increased risk to be killed this way. Black folks are almost twice as likely to be killed while walking. And Native folks are at really heightened risk, almost 5 times as likely to be killed as the average person. But it's not just about race, although I'm going to talk more about how race impacts the problem. A lot of people from a lot of marginalized groups are disproportionately impacted by this problem. So another group is older folks. And this is a nice graphic produced by Smart Growth America. Basically what it shows is people who are older than 75 are twice as likely to be killed while walking. And some of the reasons for that are fairly obvious. They're a little bit more frail. They also may move more slowly. But one thing that's important to point out about this is this demographic is one of the fastest growing in the United States. And we have not done a very good job planning for this demographic, especially when they're walking. So as early as about 10 years ago, some people actually predicted, like people at the CDC predicted that because of the aging of the American populace, pedestrian deaths would occur. So I think this in part can explain the rising numbers. Okay, so this is also a problem that has a geographic component. And this map, again, Smart Growth America, Transportation for America, shows the most dangerous states for pedestrians here in purple. And then the safest are here in green. And as you can see, there's a very clear geographic pattern here as well. All but one of the most dangerous are in the southeast. And the safest places are sort of the more developed, the older cities in the northeast and the Midwest. So there's a really easy explanation for this. And if you think back to some of those first photos I showed of how Cleveland was relatively developed in 1930 before cars were the primary mode of transportation. That's the way it is for some of these cities like, Boston or, maybe parts of Minneapolis. But for places in Florida that are almost without exception the most dangerous places to walk in the United States, almost all these cities and suburbs developed after 1940, developed after cars were the primary mode of transportation in the United States. So they have very wide roads. A lot of times they have very suburban land use, which makes them dangerous places to walk. So again, this is a little bit about geography, but this is also this can also help explain why we've been seeing pedestrian deaths increase, because almost without exception for the last decade, these are the kind of places that have captured most of the population growth in the United States. Places like Dallas and Houston and parts of Florida are some of the fastest growing places in the United States, and not the Bostons. Okay, so a little bit more about how race plays into this, race and racism. So again, I'm using Cleveland as an example where I live, but this is pretty universalifiable to almost every city in the United States, the stuff I'm talking about. So this is a map that shows racial segregation in Cleveland. And the green shows concentrations of where Black people are living, sort of segregated Black neighborhoods. And then orange shows areas that are segregated white areas. And this is in 1990. So I just want to go forward 20 years and take a look at what happens here. So Cleveland goes from looking like this to like this. And we don't have the most recent census data, but I would assume that this trend has continued or even accelerated. And it is a more pronounced trend in some growing areas as well. So basically, Cleveland is still very segregated, as you can see, but we do have our suburban areas are becoming more diverse, kind of across the region. And again, that's a national trend. Sometimes we hear this talked about, and race obviously isn't a perfect proxy for income, but we do hear, but there is a good deal of overlap. And we hear about this phenomenon of the suburbanization of poverty. So again, that's a national trend. We have more folks with lower incomes out in suburban areas that don't have sort of the best facilities for people on foot or for people who are riding the bus, places that maybe were never designed for people to walk. And now we have a lot more diversity in those places. Again, that's probably contributing to the problem. So just to sort of, and to talk a little bit about how racism ties into this. So going back, here's sort of the racial segregation demographics in Cleveland. Now here's a graphic that was produced locally that shows the most dangerous road segments in Cleveland. And the thing I want to point out here is just how closely they align with areas of concentration of people of color in Cleveland. It's almost a perfect match. And that is sort of not unusual, unfortunately. Okay, so I want to talk about this a little bit more, and I'm going to use Portland's now as an example instead of Cleveland's. But this is a really nice graphic they produced at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. It shows 2 years of traffic fatalities in the city, and they use the names of the victims here to kind of humanize the issue, which I think is a really nice touch. But one thing I want to point out, and I think it's pretty obvious, is that they're not sort of happening in a random pattern. There's a clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So I want to talk about what's going on there. Okay, so in Portland, there is a sort of a demographic fault line. And we have these kind of fault lines in all of our cities. And in Portland, that is East 82nd Street. It's right here on this map, if you can see. Okay, so in Portland, everything that's east of East 82nd Street is East Portland. So, and the important thing to know about that is East Portland is poorer and more diverse than the rest of the city. Higher proportion of immigrants, higher proportion of people with lower education levels are in East Portland. Now, in addition, those neighborhoods are not getting the same kind of safety treatments that some of the wealthier, whiter neighborhoods are getting. So they produce this map again, and it shows the 30 highest crash intersections in Portland. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. And so every year, or during these 2 years in Portland, 50% of traffic fatalities occurred in East Portland, even though only about a quarter of the population lives there. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about how racism plays into this. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Native people are at extreme risk for being killed while walking. And we actually don't fully understand the reasons for that, but one reason does seem to be that tribal areas and reservations, there's a good deal of walking that goes on there. They function a little bit like a traditional small town where people are doing a lot of trips on foot. But they tend to be located in very rural areas like this. And this was, I borrowed this from a study done at the University of Minnesota where they looked at this issue at a number of reservations in the state pretty closely. And as you can see from this photo, on one side of this photo is a food cellar, and on the other side is a tribal service center. And as you can see, residents have worn these paths in the grass, and they're having to cross this very high-speed rural road that has no accommodations for pedestrians at all. So the people from this study, the researchers, they went out to these reservations and they talked to the tribal elders, they talked to the people that live there. And this issue of pedestrian safety came up all the time. People were saying this is our top transportation concern, but there seemed to be a disconnect between what people were saying locally and the people who were really affected by the problem and the sort of official response from the state DOT. So they interviewed the folks at the state DOT, and those folks almost never brought up this issue of pedestrian safety. And even when they were pressed on it, they sort of defaulted to these behavioral prescriptions, like they would talk about drunk driving or drunk walking. So one thing I think that this study sort of highlights is a little bit of how institutional racism can play out. Probably the guys at the Minnesota State DOT were mostly white, and there wasn't enough sort of respect for local knowledge in this case, and that can be part of the problem. Okay, so I sort of warned you guys a little bit about this, but I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about cars, because that's a big part of the problem as well. But just to reiterate, there's a few things going on. We have some demographic changes in the United States where the population is aging. So a lot of people are a little bit more vulnerable physically to being hit and killed this way. Secondly, we have a lot of migration to the Sunbelt region of the United States, which is very hostile to pedestrians in general. We also have another demographic, geographic trend where we have more suburbanization of poverty. In some places we have gentrification that's pushing lower income folks out to suburban areas. And in other cases, there's just, growth in the suburbs. So all those put more people out in locations that are risky. And at the same time, we have cars. We have this big change in our vehicle fleet in the United States over the last 10 years. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And this is a graphic. If you look back to about 2012, when we're coming out of the last recession, about 3 out of 4 new cars being sold that model year were sedans. So they're sort of like your Honda Civic, your traditional car. But over the last decade, that has reversed itself. At the most recent year, about 3 out of 4 new vehicles sold were either pickup trucks or SUVs. So it turns out that has a big impact on pedestrian safety. And just real quickly, here's a picture I took, but just to sort of give a sense for the size difference in some of these vehicles. So, this is kind of a compact car, but just notice how much bigger this car here on the left is. It's a crossover SUV. And one thing I wanted to point out about this is that they have the same sort of seating capacity. This white car might have a little bit more cargo space, but basically we've traded these kind of cars for these kind of cars. And there's a lot more room sort of right here in the lower portion. Okay, so that changes the physics of a car crash with a pedestrian a lot. I use myself here. I'm about a 5'6" woman, which is like average to tall woman, sort of for scale. And you can see over here on the left, this is a Honda Civic. If I got hit by a Honda Civic, it would hit me in the legs. But if I got hit by this car over here, this is a Toyota 4Runner, notice it would hit me more like in the chest or the stomach. And that's right where your vital organs are. It's just not a good place to experience blunt force trauma. So there's a very clear data that shows this is a real problem and is really contributing to this issue. As early as 2015, the Federal Highway Administration released a report. It was a review of a lot of research, and it found that pedestrians are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed if they're hit by an SUV than by a sedan. In addition, this is a photo I use in all my presentations. It shows my son when he was 4 years old in front of a lifted F-250. But just to show how enormous pickup trucks have gotten at the same time as well. And one thing about this is that these kind of vehicles with this very high front end, they have this macho look, and auto companies are able to sell these for a real premium. They're making, like on the Chevy Silverado, auto companies are making about $17,000 in profit, I've read, for every vehicle they sell. So a huge profit margin. But very dangerous, big blind spots at close range. There's different groups. There's also huge blind spots in the rear. About 50 children in the United States are backed over every week. And most of them are backed over by a close relative in their own driveways. The front blind zones are a big problem as well. There's different groups that have done experiments where they put sat or as many as 27 children can sit in the blind zone of this vehicle and be entirely invisible to the driver. So it's a big liability. Just to walk you through the evolution of one vehicle, just because I think it's interesting. And and I'm really interested in cars. This is 1996 RAV4. The reason I use RAV4 is because it's the #1 selling vehicle in the United States outside of pickup trucks. So just to walk through its evolution, you can see back in 1996, and this is the first crossover in the United States. It was actually just, you can see how little and cute it is. It was actually just like a modified Toyota Corolla. It has sort of a smiling little face, 2 doors, as light as 2,500 pounds. This was the 2-door model, I should mention, but okay, just going forward, 13 years, you can see how much larger it's gotten. Almost 800 pounds heavier, much meaner, higher front end. And then again, if we looked at 2019, it actually is not a lot heavier than the 2009 model, but I just think it's interesting how much meaner the front end is, meaner looking the face of the vehicle is. So that's just a trend that's happening in vehicles in the United States. And there's some really interesting, if anyone wants to read more about it, there's a guy named Keith Bradsher that wrote a really interesting book about it in the early 2000s. But he gets into the sort of the psychology of this and how, unfortunately, people have this sort of negative impulse to want to have a vehicle that looks very violent. And automakers have really capitalized on that in recent years, unfortunately, at the expense of safety. Okay, so all of that is very sad and a bummer, but I want to talk a little bit about some solutions as well, just real quickly before we wrap up. I think I have about 9 more minutes. This is something you're probably all familiar with. It's called a road diet. It's a really successful one. It's an example I use in the book. Queens Boulevard at one time was referred to as the Boulevard of Death in New York City. 186 people were killed on this road between 1996 and 2014. It's a suburban arterial, we call this, so a wide, fast road, runs through a very densely populated area. These are the most dangerous kind of roads. And in a lot of cities, just one road or a handful of roads account for a grossly disproportionate share of these kind of injuries and deaths. So this was one of those roads, but in 2014, New York City pulled together $14 million and they did a road diet. They added this protected bike lane. You know, this is not an expensive change, mostly paint and bollards. And they also added, I believe they added a bus lane, a red painted bus lane on the other side too. But after that happened, the deaths just stopped. It was 4 years before there was another death on this road. There have been a couple since then, but an enormous change and a big success. Here's something else they're doing in New York City that I want to talk about that's been really successful. They're using something called pedestrian leading intervals, which all that means is they're retiming traffic signals so that pedestrians get a few seconds head start on traffic, these turning cars. So they're more visible. They're in the middle of the intersection when cars start making these really dangerous left turns. They're also using this, as you can see with the big arrow, this tool called the hardened center line, and all they've done there is stick a couple bollards in the middle of the intersection. But what that does is it forces cars to slow down and make a slower, sharper left turn. Left turns are very dangerous, both for drivers and pedestrians, because in part because drivers have these pillars right here that create big blind spots. So this is a very inexpensive treatment. It only costs New York City about $1,200 per intersection to install these, but it's been very effective. And the advocates there credit these treatments, which they've done at thousands of intersections, with helping produce a 35 to 40% reduction in pedestrian deaths there. Okay. This is another success story. And if I was there, I would ask you guys to guess what cities they are. And if anyone wants to unmute themselves, if they know, and yell it out, go ahead. I'll give you a second. All right, well, I'm giving up on you guys. I thought maybe we had some Detroiters in the house, but this This is an image shot from space at night, obviously, and it shows Detroit up here at the top and Cleveland, again, where I live, at the bottom. So one thing you notice about this picture is that Detroit is sort of a bluer hue at night than Cleveland. And again, that's a big success story. So Detroit did a big survey in 2012, 2013, and they found out that about 40% of their streetlights were broken or not functioning for some reason. So streetlights are a big underlooked issue when it comes to pedestrian safety. About 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night. So again, I think this goes back a little bit to privilege and the privilege of the people sort of in decision-making roles, the privilege of people, myself included, who are prominent urban planning voices, can sort of take for granted that the streetlights in our neighborhood are going to function. But that's not the case for everyone, especially some of the groups that are more vulnerable to these kind of crashes. So in Detroit, but the happy news is in Detroit, they issued some bonds. They issued $185 million in bonds, and they fixed all the streetlights and they converted them to LED. And that's why they look more blue in that picture from space. So they replaced all their streetlights between 2014 and 2016. And here, this graph shows pedestrian deaths over time. And you can see how as soon as those streetlights get in, they sort of fall off a cliff. Pedestrian deaths over just this 2-year period declined 35% in Detroit once those were fixed. And I know that this graphic is a little hard to read, but this blue part at the top shows pedestrian deaths that occurred in dark, unlighted conditions. And you can see in 2013, they're having like 2013, 2014, they're having 25 plus pedestrian deaths in dark, unlighted conditions a year. As soon as those streetlights are fixed, those almost stop happening. They get down to having just one almost immediately. So again, big success story. They have this big drop, while in the rest of Michigan and throughout the United States, the trend is going the opposite way. Okay, just wrapping up real quick. Here's just another project I like in Baltimore. They had a really tricky sort of street. It went through a highway area. It didn't have sidewalks. It was in a very dense area. And rather than wait a decade to sort of overhaul it, they just put up these highway dividers and took a lane and built a safe space. I like that. I think more places should do that. Again, using Detroit as a good example. I love this. Very cheap, very effective way to tackle speeding in cities, which is such a threat to pedestrians. They're going to install 4,500 speed humps at a cost of just $11.5 million. Very cool. Okay, and I really am wrapping up now, but this is the image I like to end the presentations with. And obviously what it shows, these are called pedestrian refuge islands. And I think this is like not considered a very sexy treatment. They only cost a few $1,000s. It's not very designy, you know. It's not controversial either. The Federal Highway Administration recommends these. They say they reduce pedestrian injuries about 35% when they're installed. It doesn't really take right away from vehicles. So again, probably not going to get into like a war on cars type standoff. But I think this kind of thing has been a little bit ignored just because of not enough of the people in decision-making roles are walking for transportation and are finding themselves in dangerous places. I think if more people who were a little bit more powerful politically were, it would make a big difference. But anyway, I think this is the kind of thing that's really missing and could have a big impact. Like for myself, you know, I'm a mom of 2 young kids. I would love to see these kind of in front of every school. Like if we could be using this kind of infrastructure to make walking to school safe for kids, I think that's the kind of thing that could have a big impact on not only quality of life, but also the environment. So just to wrap things up, there's a lot of missing pieces, whether it's street lights or curb ramps or little things like crosswalks or little things like this, we sort of have to go back to all the streets that we've built and add the features that make them safe for pedestrians. We wouldn't stand for, highway systems that were missing pieces that drivers need to be safe, and we shouldn't allow that on our local roads or state roads either. Okay, so with that, just a quick plug for the book if anyone wants to pick it up. It's actually, I'll put a hyperlink in the chat. It's actually on sale for a cheaper price than this, I think, right now, just on the website in general. And with that, I think we're gonna turn it over to some questions.
Great, thank you, Angie. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I've noted a few questions I've received here in the chat, so we'll kind of get started and see where things go. We are going to keep everyone muted, so go ahead and submit any chat or any questions in the chat box, and I'll be sure we're paying attention to those. It's been while Angie's been talking, been a great discussion, so I appreciate everyone lending in their thoughts. Angie, I have, let's see, what should we start with? Here's one. Do you find, actually, we'll start here. Can you talk a little bit about the Vision Zero campaign? I think that's something that's been going on around the world, and how effective you think that has been in solving some of these issues.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in case people aren't familiar, Vision Zero is this concept that originated in Sweden. I write about it in the book, but it basically, it's this paradigm shift in the way we think about traffic deaths. In the United States, our sort of approach to traffic safety has been, let's say we had 40,000 deaths last year, we'll aim for 5% fewer. So we'll aim for 37,000 traffic deaths. But there was, in the 1990s, they had a leader in Sweden who said, this isn't right. We shouldn't be tolerating any number of deaths on our roads. We have to do everything we can as designers to eliminate deaths and serious injuries. It's called Vision Zero, and it's sort of considered a international best practice now. And many cities in the United States have committed to the idea in principle, and many other cities also have adopted Vision Zero plans. So how well is that working? I wish I could say that it had been a super game changing, but, and it's very early in the process. Only a few cities have really devoted significant resources to it, New York being one of them. And in 2018, New York saw its traffic deaths fall to an all-time low. They had not been as low in 100 years, basically since the introduction of cars. Since that time, it has increased a little bit. So we're all kind of watching the San Franciscos and the New Yorks. And I think in the next decade or two, it's possible we could see a city achieve Vision Zero, zero deaths, as maybe like a San Francisco or a Seattle. Oslo, Norway just had a year where they only had 1 traffic death. So they are sort of proving it's possible. But there's a lot of question about in the United States whether the cities that have made verbal commitments or written commitments to Vision Zero, how committed they are, whether they've appropriated the right kind of resources. Also, I don't think there's been very good federal support for it. I think it would really help if the federal government stepped up with some money to encourage states and cities to get serious about it.
Great. Yeah, I know it's, I believe it's something, I don't know when it was implemented in or launched in DC, and I'm not sure how that's been going. We have the Piedmont Environmental Council's president, Chris Miller, is also here to help answer some questions, as is our colleague at the Coalition for Smarter Growth, Stuart Schwartz. So if either of you want to chime in on any of this, that would be great. The next question I have here is, okay, this is about solutions and how they're being implemented. So do you find that even if there's a general acknowledgement of the issues associated with pedestrian fatalities and a desire to fix them, that the solutions are not being implemented in an equitable way? Yeah. I know this is, I've been spending a lot of time recently in DC and on the street in Mount Pleasant, they're a higher income, and they just put in a slow street sign, and they did some of that. But I wonder where else in DC this is not being implemented. Go ahead,
Hey,
Angie.
Angie, before you start, I'd like to tack on a piece to that question is you gave great stats about the problem not being equitably distributed, right? And so a targeted solution could be appropriate, but how do we center the voices of those who are most affected?
Yeah, that's really important. So that's absolutely right, that a lot of times, I think one of the big ways cities are going wrong is the places that least need these kind of interventions are first in line, and the places that need them the most aren't getting them. And there's a really good researcher named Charles Brown at Rutgers. He wrote the foreword to my book, and one thing he says, I quote him in the book as saying this, and I do it in my presentations too, I want to make sure he gets credit. He says, white neighborhoods, when they complain, when they have a safety problem, they get treatments, they get safety treatments. And when Black and brown neighborhoods complain, they get enforcement. So they get police coming out to their neighborhoods, ticketing them for jaywalking, and oftentimes that evolves into a really horrible situation. It's just bad. It's just bad policy. So we do need to, so back to your question, we do need to better target these towards the neighborhoods that need them most. And we need to have a lot of humility when we come in there as planners about what the solutions are. Really need to be listening and letting the community drive the conversation. Because I do think across the board, even in a wealthy neighborhood, this is a very localized problem. That the issue might be different from place to place. It may be curb ramps are a problem by an area that serves a lot of people with disabilities. It could be crosswalk timing is too slow in an area where there's a lot of where there's a lot of older people. So regardless of the neighborhood, I really think plugging into sort of the local knowledge, letting the folks on the ground sort of drive the discussion is important, but especially in neighborhoods that are marginalized and have been overlooked for this kind of thing.
Marco and Peter, this is Stuart. Did we get to there was a question about the enforcement issue and the differential enforcement. That may be a natural fall. And Angie talked about how enforcement is focused in some neighborhoods. I know, Angie, you've had some thoughts about this and the role of enforcement.
Yeah, I actually didn't write a lot about enforcement in the book, and except to point out that when there is jaywalking enforcement, it has pretty much always been racist. Like it's very, like the data is very compelling that Black and brown folks, particularly young Black men, are unfairly targeted, that the penalty really is sort of extreme. A lot of the fines and stuff compared to the infraction. Oftentimes the stops escalate because people are, I think, reasonably mad about being singled out for something that's so harmless. So the jaywalking enforcement, I think, is a bad idea. I think the city should be thinking about doing away with jaywalking laws altogether, or at minimum, just having their police know they should not be enforcing it because they just have not been doing a good job. And it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive in a lot of ways because pedestrians are very marginalized. And when we go out and sort of pick on them and sort of question their right to the road, which is what often happens, it contributes to that. It makes the problem worse. So, but I didn't talk a lot in the book about enforcement for drivers outside of some discussion of, there was a big political fight over traffic cameras in school zones in New York City. But obviously it's a very controversial issue. And I think like planners of color are sort of leading the discussion about that. And but we really ought to be more focused on the street level stuff right now.
Angie, how do you think the rise in autonomous vehicles might impact any of the issues you've been talking about today.
Yeah, I have like a whole chapter in the book where I talk about this. And basically what I say is that the people I talked to about this were not optimistic that we would see fully autonomous vehicles anytime soon. And I talked to some very knowledgeable people about this. They just, so there's a sort of an open question about that at best, we'll say. Whether fully autonomous vehicles are truly right around the corner is, a lot of people are skeptical about that. But one thing I did say in the book that I am really optimistic about is we have all these partially automated features that are starting to come in cars, especially high-end cars. So cars are coming with automatic emergency braking, which means that they automatically brake before hitting things in some cases. There's some good evidence that shows that can be really beneficial in lowering traffic injuries and can benefit pedestrians. We also have stuff like automatic pedestrian detection coming online, and there is some data that shows that can be effective in combination with some of these other technologies. But one thing I would say about that is the federal government has not gotten involved in regulating it. They don't require automatic pedestrian detection, so there isn't a lot of assurance that it will perform at a minimum level. So that's a problem. The federal government, one thing I want to mention is, has never imposed any regulations on automakers entirely to protect pedestrians or cyclists. All the auto regulations, all the safety regulations have only so far protected passengers and drivers. And that is probably part of the reason why we see pedestrian and cycling deaths sort of departing from what we see for drivers and passengers.
Great. Let's see here. Are there some solutions that haven't proven to be very effective? I know you mentioned a few at the end there, Angie, but I don't know if you could think of anything that people often assume will help and doesn't really address the issue.
Yeah, so there's like a lot of the work that's been done around this has been education. Pedestrian education. So that can take a lot of forms, like it could be some PSAs, even some of the, I don't know. I was going to say, even sometimes drivers will be targeted, and who knows how effective that is. But yeah, I don't think that's very effective at all. Again, it can sometimes take on this form of like pedestrian shaming that can sort of contribute to the marginalization of pedestrians. I would love to see like some education aimed at drivers that made their responsibilities a little bit more clear. I feel like even if there is any sort of campaigns or outreach directed at drivers, it's always very squishy. It sort of says pedestrians and drivers both have a responsibility here, and it never sort of discusses the power imbalance there and how much more vulnerable pedestrians are and how the environment is often so hostile to them. So yeah, the education stuff I don't think is very effective.
Great. Well, I think we're trying to keep it to an hour here. I know there were actually a number of questions we did not get to. Peter and I can follow up with Angie and others to try to address those. And we'll be sending out an email sometime this week with the recording, and maybe we'll try to get to some of those. But before I turn over to you, Peter, Stuart.
Before Peter, I've got two quick announcements from College for Smarter Growth. Number one is we're hoping for an arterial design meetup of officials hosted by the Council of Governments, DC Council of Governments, because Sonia Bree, who's on the call with me, and other members of our team are working on that because we think our suburban arterials are among the biggest problems we have in the DC area. And that's what the reports have shown. In addition, Sonia's working with many others in Northern Virginia and with George Mason University on an active transportation summit for March, building on this number of sessions this year. And maybe we can get Angie back for that.
That's
Thanks, Angie.
Great. Awesome. Thanks,
Peter,
so much.
I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can just get this last slide up. Angie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for hosting me and the nice introduction, for being such a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. That was so good, and you know, an hour felt like it was definitely not enough. Fortunately, there are a couple of ways to get deeper in the work, and specifically with Angie's work. Here's a happy announcement that I'd like to share, which is that the city of Charlottesville is co-sponsoring with us a right-of-way reading club. And so it'll be a periodic gathering to read through the book. And the city even purchased a couple of books for those who would like them. Information about that in the follow-up email. And also I posted a sign-up link in the chat. Also, if you want to get to work right away, Charlottesville's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee is meeting this Thursday at 5 o'clock. It's virtual. I'm posting info about that in the chat too. And then, of course, tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. And remember that none of this work can happen without your support. So with that, I thank everybody for joining us and making it a great evening. And please have a great rest of the evening as well.